I'm now going to turn it over to my wonderful co-convener.
Hi, so I'm Uli Strasser. I am a co-director in European Studies and German Studies. The other director, co-director is here, Frank Bies, and we are very happy to be co-sponsoring this event and this series today. In politics, media, and scholarship, Europe is often portrayed as a homogeneous, white, and Christian continent. This is an ideological representation that goes back to the Middle Ages, but it has done much to distort the historical reality of Europe's multicultural and multi-religious past and also present. So with our lecture series this year and next year, we seek to contribute to a shift in the popular and scholarly imagination by bringing leading scholars, artists, and activists of Black Europe to our campus. Collectively, they foreground the centuries-long presence of peoples of African descent in Europe, as well as their contemporary cultural expressions and political concerns. Now, we are very pleased that today we get to host Professor Tiffany Florvil. She holds an appointment at the University of New Mexico as an Associate Professor in 20th century European and gender history. Her research centers on histories of post-45 Europe, the African Black diaspora, social movements, Black internationalism, and gender and sexuality. Professor Florvil is a very prominent voice in Black German studies today, shaping and pushing this field forward. I want to mention only a few of her contributions. First of all, I want to flag a co-edited volume that she did with Vanessa Plumley entitled Rethinking Black German Studies, Approaches, Interventions, and Histories, which appeared with Peter Lang Press in 2018. Now, secondly, I want to mention and have a big shout out for her path-breaking monograph entitled Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women and the Making of a Transnational Movement, which was published by University of Illinois Press in 2020. This book is the first comprehensive account of the modern Black German movement of the 1980s to the 2000s, and it puts women and gender squarely at the center of the story. The study has received multiple accolades. They include the Waterloo Center for German Studies First Book Prize, being listed as the best Black books of 2020 by Black Perspectives, and also glowing reviews for the work on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, I think it's particularly fortuitous that Professor Florvil is speaking to us on International Women's Day, because her work not only foregrounds the role of Black German women and their importance in shaping Black politics in Germany, but she also really traces the range of these women's internationalism, their far-reaching diasporic ties of fictive kinship, deep affection, and political solidarity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Florvil to our campus.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I was like, is that me? So I'm going to get started. I am very delighted to be in person. You guys are my first in-person talk since 2019. Jazz hands of excitement for me. And I also want to thank the BPS, German Studies, and European Studies for the invitation. And a special thanks and shout out to Anna Marie for all of her awesomeness. So without further ado, in her 2013 book on intellectual activism, Black feminist sociologist Patricia Hill Collins describes intellectual activism as, and I quote, the myriad ways that people place the power of their ideas in service to social justice, end quote. The negotiation of shifting notions of exclusion and inclusion, as well as belonging and unbelonging, also characterize intellectual activism. For Collins, there are two strategies that undergird intellectual activism. They include speaking truth to power, which seeks to challenge the status quo and power hierarchies, and speaking truth to the people, meaning disseminating their knowledge widely through the visual arts, music, poetry, fiction, essays, journal articles, nonfiction, books, and videography. This work entails the commitment of activist intellectuals, artists, and others who use multiple expressions of intellectualism for social change in the everyday. These different forms of creative work gave rise to social movements against racism and other forms of discrimination in and beyond Europe. This was certainly the case for Black German activist intellectuals, whose creative work helped them create a diasporic and anti-racist movement in the 1980s and 90s. In their movement, they used their intellectual activism to challenge normative notions of whiteness and to confront Black people's historical erasure in the German nation, while also relying on diverse tools that rendered everyday and institutional racism visible. Black Germans offer an example of intellectual activism in praxis, in which they centered excluded narratives of African-descended peoples, especially their cultures, thoughts, and cosmologies. They used their marginalized positions in Germany to reclaim control and agency and legitimize their modes of being and knowing. Indeed, Black German women were key innovators of intellectual activism in the movement. They proved how power and knowledge were generative and liberating, enabling new ways of thinking, understanding, and acting out personal and/or collective identities. Their forms of knowledge production and circulation allow them to exist beyond the narrow confines of the Enlightenment construction of man, who always remained able-bodied, cis-white, and non-queer. And here I'm sort of engaging with Sylvia Wynter's concept of the overrepresentation of man, someone who's always gendered, white, male, and the like. And here's a little image of her chilling in a chair, being, scholarly and awesome. In this presentation, I argue that Black German women such as Maya Ayim and Ricky Reiser became what I refer to as quotidian intellectuals, a concept that I discuss in my book, Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women in the Making of a Transnational Movement. Plug, there she is. As quotidian intellectuals, Black Germans imparted different kinds of knowledge through multiple mediums that relied on everyday aesthetics and that recognized how the everyday should be intellectual. Employing many vernacular forms such as graphic artwork, diasporic symbols, workshops, and spoken word poetry, Black Germans stressed their creativity, signaling why material, cultural, and geographic contexts matter. These quotidian intellectuals counter their historical and intellectual erasure by normalizing the field of Black German studies and inventing new definitions of intellectualism in the process. Their intellectual pursuits empower them to cultivate connections with their Black counterparts across Germany and the globe. As examples of quotidian intellectuals, I focus on Maya Ayim and Ricky Reiser, but certainly other women and men in the Black German movement, such as Katharina Gontoya, Marion Kraft, John Cantata, Tahir Della, and Helga Emda were as well. Yet, Ayim and Reiser, both prominent figures in the Black German movement in different ways, made significant epistemic interventions that allowed them to write themselves into history and recover narratives that were not found in traditional German spaces or archives. It was a powerful act of remembering and recovery. And in the process, they decolonized German knowledge by what scholar Brittany Cooper refers to as listing. Here is an image, and I'm drawing from her really awesome book, Beyond Respectability. And listing was a historically rooted process that allowed African American women in the United States to create a genealogy of Black women's intellectualism by recognizing their lives and scholarship and resisting their intellectual erasure. For Black German women, listing in journals and poetry, along with other political events, afforded them an opportunity to document the narratives of Black diasporic figures from the past and the present, and to carve out spaces for the Black diaspora and Black Germanness in the nation. Together, these women's actions and ideas exemplify how the Black German movement not only was a site for lobbying and political work, but also intellectualism. Without a doubt, Black Germans' politics and poetics demonstrate how the production and dissemination of their knowledge proved to be a source of power, solidarity, and resistance. In the movement, Black German quotidian intellectuals like Ayim and Reiser created Blackened knowledge that undercut the power of dominant knowledge and representations of the diaspora, in which they rejected negative assumptions about Blackness. With their forms of intellectual activism, both women affirm their agency and exercise power that they used in the service of the larger Black German community, as well as other marginalized people locally, nationally, and internationally. For Reiser, she did this through her editorial work, writing and artwork in AfroLook, a prominent Black German magazine. Her cultural and political work was rooted in, yet extended beyond, the German nation. In AfroLook, she gave space to other forms of knowledge that were marginalized or ignored in the German mainstream. With Ayim, she accomplished this through her grassroots activism, in which she engendered and imparted knowledge to diverse audiences in and beyond Germany. Through their industry of making many different forms of art and literature, these quotidian intellectuals contributed to a Black public sphere and challenged Black Germans' exclusion from the nation. The first section of my paper shows how knowledge and power underpinned the Black German activism, or basically undergirded their activism. Power emerged in critical ways for Black German quotidian intellectuals, especially in their words and actions. The second section turns to Reiser and Ayim and recognizes how their power and knowledge served as forms of resistance. Their internationalism compelled them to form connections with other diverse individuals, and their intellectual activism grounded them. Through their work, they brought the Black diaspora from the margins to the center, disrupting normative forms of German knowledge. Both women reveal how intellectual activism was, and I quote, a multifaceted phenomenon that linked content and process, ideas and actions, and oppression and resistance, end quote. Reiser's and Ayim's involvement in the Black German movement marked a significant stage in their lives. Let me now turn to that movement. I'm gonna take a little sip of water. Okay. The modern Black German movement began in the mid-1980s with the establishment of two cultural and political organizations: the Initiative of Black Germans, Initiative Schwarze Deutsche, and Afro-German Women, or Afro-Deutsche Frauen, ADEFRA. ISD was an anti-racist organization that organized consciousness-raising workshops, social gatherings, and anti-discrimination protests. ADEFRA, the sister organization of ISD, was a feminist organization that focused on anti-racism, feminism, and gendered themes. Local chapters for both organizations emerged in cities across West Germany, and later in former East German cities. In addition to local chapters and organizational events, ISD also published AfroLook from 1988 to 1999, and ADEFRA produced Afriketta from 1988 to 1990. These magazines were important sites for community building and cultural expression. AfroLook and Afriketta also contributed to what I argue in the book, a Black public sphere in Germany that included other journals, as AWA Findaba, an African cultural and literary journal that was published from 1983 to 1988, and Isvevian, an African and also diasporic journal published by African writers and artists from 1990 to 1992. So I'm just sort of showing you that AfroLook, Afriketta are part of a larger sort of intersection of diasporic journals and expats in Germany more broadly. In addition to that, Caribbean American author and activist Audre Lorde has often been described as a catalyst for the Black German movement. But she was actually one of many diasporic resources that Black German quotidian intellectuals relied upon during the early stages of their movement. And here is a fabulous image. Lorde is in the middle. Maya Ayim is wearing the lovely white leaf earrings, and Katharina Oguntoya is wearing the black shirt. As a visiting professor at the Free University of Berlin from April to July 1984, Lorde's interactions with Black German women such as Mai and Katharina and Ike Hugel-Marshall inside and outside of the classrooms proved to be important for the formation and growth of their new movement. Ayim's and Oguntoya's conversations with Lorde and one another led to what I see as one of the first interplays of power and knowledge in the initial stages of the movement. They, with Lorde's support, created a new lexicon with the designations of Afro-German, Afro-Deutsche, and Black Germans, Schwarze Deutsche. So these terms are basically created at this moment. And they're created in like 1984. So this is a recent creation in terms of solidifying language and racialized language in the German context. These concepts offered new forms of Black knowledge that disrupted the fixity of German identity as based on whiteness alone. Ayim and Oguntoye engage Edward Bonilla Silva's concept of a racial grammar, which, and I quote, influenced their vision, emotion, and sense of aesthetics, in addition to the way that Germans talk about and frame racial matters, end quote. So I a little tweaked his quotation to sort of fit the German context a little. These women instantiated their imagined community through language, shifting normative ways of knowing. Oguntoye and Ayim also recognized Germany's social organizations centered on their exclusion and difference, and signified unequal power relations among government institutions, state and federal, Black Germans, people of color, and their white German counterparts. Their acts sought to unsettle and contest these power dynamics. These women and others in the movement imbued Blackness with new political and intellectual meanings, defying racist discourses that previously excluded and silenced them. Their efforts at self-renaming were cultural and political acts that served as an epistemic intervention, and that enabled Black Germans to enter the public sphere on their own terms. Historically, Afro-descended peoples were excluded from the public sphere, but also included in degrading ways, such as the Volksschau or people show or human zoo tradition. They were also sort of hypersexualized, so included in hypersexualized imagery. So it's not necessarily a positive rendering of people of African descent in the German context. This is not to suggest that this is not happening elsewhere in Europe. So this is a common dynamic. African descended peoples were also excluded from the public sphere because they were considered what Angela Zimmerman has referred to as natural peoples, individuals allegedly lacking in history and culture and presumed to be inferior to European cultural peoples. Moreover, white Germans' practice with Morris Egge has called an Afro-Americanophilia that involved the appropriation, exoticization, and celebration of African-American popular culture. As a result of this practice, white Germans tended to accept and celebrate Black diasporic writers, such as Toni Morrison, Angela Davis, and Alice Walker, who were routed to but not rooted in the nation. And so here's another image of Audre Lorde, who's also revered, and Ayim. And then here is an image of Toni Morrison and Angela Davis. So Angela Davis becomes this key figure, especially after her arrest and the campaign to free her. There were Free Angela Davis campaigns on both sides of the wall in West Germany and East Germany. And this is one of the sort of plakats or from East Germany in terms of freedom for Angela Davis, Freiheit für unsere Angela Davis. Therefore, Black German self-definition and curation empowered them after enduring years of invisibility and loneliness in a majority white German polity. Through their organizing, they engendered new productive spaces and meanings for identity, resistance, and belonging that evolved within their larger movement. Oguntoye, Ayim, and other quotidian intellectuals also dealt with the epistemic violence of the pervasive exclusionary German discourses that were normalized and codified in legislation at the state and federal levels, in institutions, archives, and schools, and in everyday parlance and practice. In this regard, Marissa Fuentes' work on enslaved women in 17th century Barbados has been useful for me. According to Fuentes, and I quote, "Enslaved women appear as historical subjects through the form and content of archival documents and the manner in which they lived, spectacularly violated, objectified, disposable, hypersexualized, and silenced. This violence transferred from enslaved bodies to the documents that count, condemn, assess, and evoke them, and we receive them in this condition," end quote. The experience of some Black Germans is not located entirely in the narrative of slavery or the Middle Passage, and colonization occurred outside of Germany's borders, even though it assisted in the creation of those same borders and institutions. But this is also how individuals of African descent have appeared historically in the German context, spectacularly violated, objectified, disposable, hypersexualized, and silenced. Thus, Black Germans' act of renaming and curation was a mode of resistance against Germany's imposition of otherness and the privileging of what Black German scholar Maisha Uma refers to as a super whiteness. This knowledge emboldened them to rebel against Germany's racecraft, calling attention to how said racecraft impinged on the rights of minority communities inside and outside of the nation. And here it's important to note that they're also stressing, the German colonial context too. They're very keen to say, look, Germany had a short-lived colonial period, but it was a significant part of their identity and sort of characterization of their sort of formation of who they were. Both Ayim and Oguntoya continued to produce new racialized and gendered knowledge as they conducted interviews with other multi-generational Black German women across West Germany, and they worked on research about Germany's Black diaspora more broadly. Their work culminated in the critical anthology Farbekennen. So clearly the first image is the new imprint of Farbekennen, which came out in 2020. So, and then this is the English translation of it, showing our colors, Afro-German Women Speak Out, that was published in 1992. And this, again, I argue, serves as another example of an epistemic intervention. Published in 1986 and edited by Ayim, Oguntoya, and Dagmar Schultz, the owner of feminist press Orlando, they constructed new spaces figuratively and literally, which enabled Black Germans to articulate claims of inclusion within the nation. Ayim and Oguntoya's power functioned through their production and circulation of new ideas about Germany's Black diaspora, challenging the notion of a Germany without Blackness. The volume also rehabilitated multi-generational Black German womanhood, sharing practices of intimacy and survival. In the process, they subverted the racist white gaze and allowed Black German women such as Abina Aramako, Helga Emda, Raya Lebinitsky, Eleanor Binroff-Kolabi to discuss their common experiences of racism, in turn revealing the importance of the everyday. And here, throughout the volume, they're talking about the experiences of everyday racism they're dealing with, the pervasiveness of advertisements in the everyday. So it's very much a project that's grounded much more in the everyday than previous scholars have recognized. Their feminist and diasporic texts also afforded Black Germans with an opportunity for recognition, not only through word of mouth and public readings across Germany, but also internationally in published reviews of the volume and at a variety of Global South feminist conferences in the 1980s and 1990s. In this way, there was also power in Farbekennen's reach. The variety of events that Black Germans organized in their movement also represented the interplay of knowledge and power, shaping their intellectual activism. Indeed, at the first 1985 national meeting of Black Germans in Wiesbaden, which sparked the movement and led to the establishment of ISD, Black Germans shared their knowledge. Disclosing their mutual experiences of isolation and exclusion, they found strength in numbers by forging new kinships. Black Germans also acquired power through seeing, hearing, and understanding that their Black Germanness, that their Blackness did in fact have a space in Germany. The meeting helped many embrace their Black Germanness and cohere as a group. The meeting helped many really also feel this sense of feeling Black German. So here it's important to show some of that sort of layers of effective connection that emerge. The initial meeting started the annual tradition of the national meeting, or Bundestreffen, or as I like to refer to them, BTs. These meetings still occur today. These events were for Black Germans and other individuals of the Black diaspora. These national meetings exemplified Black Germans' construction and maintenance of Black geographies away from the white gaze. Yet these meetings, much like subsequent Black German organizational events, also served as sites for the production and dissemination of knowledge. They addressed German racism, racial violence, and the afterlives of colonialism topics that continue to be ignored in the mainstream discourses and debates. At the Bundestreffen, Black Germans organized political workshops, historical seminars, musical performances, and other activities to not only unify and socialize with one another, but to also offer sites for intellectual exchange and edification. These were critical sites where they spoke truth to power and spoke truth to the people. So again, sort of talking about the sort of the defining characteristics of intellectual activism that Collins articulated. They were also didactic tools enabling Black Germans and other communities of color to acquire more knowledge, confidence, and agency. Through these annual events, they confronted the discursive power that made and remade their otherness. Destabilizing the power of normative knowledge and representation, Black Germans theorized, wrote, and circulated their knowledge textually, visually, and/or orally in organizational publications, workshops, conferences, and other artistic forums in the public sphere. At events such as the annual Black History Months, which I'll show you some flyers from, and I'll talk a little bit about, Black Consciousness, Black Politics Conference, or Black Women's Day workshop, for instance, Black Germans tackle the topics of anti-immigrant sentiment in Western Europe, West African politics in Mali, and/or the maintenance of Black hair topics, or Black hair, topics that were either ignored or discussed in patronizing ways in Germany. And so these are just a few of the flyers from some of the Black History Month events that take place in Germany. The first Black History Month event is from 1990, and then this is certainly from 1992. But this is also showing you, like, these aren't schickimicki, programs. Schickimicki, sorry. It's a German way of saying, fancy, sophisticated. These are sort of grassroots. They're going to, Kinko's, photocopying, stuff like that. So they become increasingly more sophisticated in terms of as we get closer and closer to the aughts. But in the beginning, they're just sort of photocopying these things, and then you're sort of making multiple copies of them. So in addition to the events, these events function as a way of building and sustaining community with other Black Germans, others in the Black diaspora, and communities of color. They also represent moments of Black joy. And so in the process, it's also important to get together at these sort of Black History Month events to be happy that you could learn about other diasporic figures in the German context and outside of the German context. And so oftentimes we think about, the everyday racism, institutional racism, which sucks, but they're also coming together in a joyous occasion to celebrate, the complexity of the diaspora. Black German quotidian intellectuals also sought to change the way that white Germans thought about and identified race and racism, and understood themselves and their own representation. So these events were not restricted to Black people alone. They encouraged white Germans to attend, and they did attend, but there were also some Black people or POC events, so seminars and workshops that were only geared for people of color. Together, these activities represent how diffuse power was in the movement and how Black Germans' efforts to reclaim their place in the nation occurred through the creation of alternative forms of knowledge at their organizational poetry readings, conferences, or lectures. And these intellectual practices, in turn, open up spaces for their causes, histories, and identities. Reiser's internationalism and activism served similar functions. Through her work in AfroLook, she offered possibilities for the diasporic community and gained prominence in the same community. And here we have AfroLook, which is the journal that I mentioned briefly in the intro. And it's sort of, these are both from 1993. And it sort of shows you the sort of wider range in some capacity of what they were able to sort of represent. Under Reiser's direction, AfroLook continued to promote Black internationalist perspectives and foregrounded many everyday diasporic ideas, practices, and movements, including Pan-Africanism. AfroLook was also a form of listing, where Reiser engendered a diasporic genealogy in each issue. The magazine also established new value systems that were disconnected from traditional German culture. AfroLook, similar to other Black German cultural productions, became a tangible source of power for its readers and contributors.
Reiser officially assumed the editorial reins of AfroLook during the 1992-1993 issue, which is this one, and continued as editor until the last issue in 1999. She'd been involved informally with the AfroLook since 1991. So prior to her official reign, she was still involved in some capacity with the editorial team. Though Reiser worked with an editorial team at different times that included Black Germans such as Janine Cantata, Noria Ashafa, and Regina Stein, she remained a key figure associated with the magazine. I should also note that Black German men were involved in the movement and involved in the editorial process of AfroLook. I'm just focusing only on the ladies. So fitting because it's National, International Women's Day. So in the early years, AfroLook appeared at least once a year, but starting in 1993, the magazine became a quarterly. After 1997, the issues became more sporadic until its final one in 1990. In my personal conversations with Reiser, she saw herself as bringing more stability and direction to the journal. AfroLook acquired more subscribers and sold more copies under Reiser's tenure. The figures are shifty, so she's given me some sort of numbers of how much it's grown, but I have nothing other than some of her sayings about this. So I need to do some more sleuthing when I return to Germany, be like, okay, how many really were sold? So she was delighted to integrate even more diasporic styles and genres throughout the magazine. Interestingly, Reiser attended additional courses and received certificates for computer skills, and as a result, she acquired new skills that she used to improve the graphic design of AfroLook, as well as the layout of the magazine. So keeping in mind, this is like a moment where people are using print shop. Print shop is rad, for them. Now it's like print shop pish posh. But back in the day, you had to acquire some of these additional skills to really do this. So she's going to school to learn how to do this. And this is extremely important, and I'll get to why in a minute. Along with her duties to AfroLook, Reiser negotiated the care of her daughter, Marion, who was diagnosed with Down syndrome. At times, Reiser lamented that AfroLook robbed her of her time with her daughter. Yet, Reiser remained dedicated to the magazine and always strove to make AfroLook a dynamic publication for Germany's Black diaspora by Germany's Black diaspora. And here I'm conscious on using that because the magazine doesn't only focus on the experiences of Black Germans, it really caters to the experiences of Black people more generally, not only in Germany, but also across the world. So there's interesting articles about Black Panamanians, where you're like, what? How are they engaging with this? And so this is the conscious approach to AfroLook. Here is Ricky with Donald Griffith, who's an African-American expat who has his own organization in Berlin that I can get into in the Q&A if you're interested. And this is actually, this piece, Hierarchy, is a piece that Reiser actually painted. So she's also an artist. Her accomplishments are even more notable because she never went to gymnasium, so the German equivalent of high school, which is also like, if you go the gymnasium track, you're basically sort of, going to college, as opposed to sort of like the Hauptschule or Realschule, sort of more specialized school. So she didn't get an Abitur, which is what you would receive from the German high school. She didn't get an MA degree. She didn't go out for a PhD. And this is in contrast to people like Katharina Montoya, who gets an MA, writes an MA thesis, for Ayim, who actually gets a PhD, attempts to write a dissertation and get a PhD in psychology. So this is completely different from other Black Germans in the movement. And I stress this because this gets at the heart of some of my larger interventions with the concept quotidian intellectual. Although Black Germans did not claim this self-designation for themselves, they were indeed quotidian intellectuals who shaped cultural politics and reinvented the concept of intellectualism and the character of intellectual in their movement. As a concept, quotidian intellectual offers a more inclusive approach to intellectualism that does not reside in academic institutions or political parties alone. It expands where and when one can witness intellectualism and engages with the important Alltagsgeschichte tradition in Germany, which is the history of every day. The concept also affirms that the vernacular and has always been intellectual. Finally, it centers the importance of creative work by everyday people in the everyday, akin to Collins' urgency on intellectual activism. To be sure, Reiser's work was less about cultivating particular interests and maintaining the social order, as was the case with some traditional intellectuals in Germany. In addition, her political and cultural goals, she advanced the intellectuality of everyday and subalternity to form an expansive understanding of anti-racism that would be beneficial, for all marginalized individuals in and beyond Germany. She mirrored goals within the larger Black German movement. In this way, the everyday maintains more power as a critical site for inquiry and radical change. AfroLook was one of many examples in the Black German movement that centered Black diasporic figures' everyday lives in manifold ways. Moreover, Reiser was an engaged thinker who pursued intellectual inquiry and activity outside of the realm of academia, even while she still engaged that scholarship. I should note that she was a large bibliophile. So she would go to different antique houses to collect books on the diaspora and collect a variety of artifacts about the diaspora. She covered not only everyday racism and sexism in AfroLook, but she also featured Black narratives of survival in everyday Germany and across the globe. More importantly, she gave space to the everyday experiences of many across Black Germany's diaspora, and this in turn gave these individuals more recognition and the ability to potentially hone their creative skills. In fact, Reiser symbolized an example of quotidian intellectualism par excellence. She embodied the everyday in her work as a historian, bibliophile, writer, and artist. She conducted research on people across the diaspora, visited antique stores, and acquired about individuals of African descent in a variety of ways. She centered those narratives in AfroLook. With AfroLook, she helped to amplify a Black public sphere. She shared different forms of knowledge about Spike Lee, Fela Kuti, all of these interesting diasporic figures. So Fela Kuti is a Nigerian artist, Spike Lee, famous African-American director, pretty obvious there, and Josephine Baker as well. Reiser also had, she started a number of childhood memory articles in AfroLook in which she talked about her troubling childhood experiences with white German, sadly, racist white German family members. That really, she talked about those hardships in the journal. And readers showed appreciation about her ability to convey her honesty as well as her vulnerability. As one reader remarked, "With your childhood report, you gave us all Black Germans the opportunity to identify ourselves without having to take off the mask immediately." Indeed, her personal writing in AfroLook was effective just as much as it was intellectual. This gave Reiser power and signified her willingness to allow the magazine to serve as a space for education, community, and empowerment, similar to the dynamics in the larger Black German movement. Reiser's work affirmed that power was never assumed in one form. The aesthetics of the journal also contributed to her position as an intellectual activist. And these are some of her images and some of the sort of positioning of materials in the journal. She introduced them to not only Afrocentric work, but poets and writers, and expressive art was portrayed throughout the volume. Her expressive art captured the language and culture of the Black diaspora and also connected it to a longer tradition of vernacular art in the Deep South of the United States. She made the everyday concrete, or she made the everyday intellectual in concrete ways that readers appreciated and needed. Though Reiser did not acquire Ayim's stature, these women worked to change Germany, albeit in both similar and dissimilar ways. Before I show you Ayim, I want to show you another image of the journal. And so again, that image on the bottom is an image from Reiser. So she's really sort of prominent throughout the magazine. And here we have Ayim. Make sure I'm not running out of time. Okay. Before Ayim's international prominence, she also contributed to the Black public sphere in Germany. Her work appeared in a Germany still unable to fully come to terms with its colonial history, which included the project of terror and genocide in modern-day Namibia and Tanzania, and its disavowal of Germans of color. This epistemic work, which the larger Black German movement also consistently pursued, impelled her to address how Germany's ethnocentrism buttressed their colonial and fascist endeavors, which produced and reproduced the social political category of race and implemented particular racial regimes. Black Germans and German communities of color were tethered to this colonial history that was simultaneously invisible and invisible. Moreover, with Germany's public rejection of race and tolerance of anti-Blackness and cultural racisms in the post-war period, white Germans continued to evade their material, discursive, and effective effects on non-white subjects, especially Black Germans like Ayim. To this effect, Ayim hosted and participated in conferences in Germany that foregrounded those historical legacies and post-colonial present, while fostering cross-cultural solidarities. She and Nidvita Prasad, an Indian-German activist, organized the 1990 conference Ways to Alliances, occurring in Bremen for ethnic and Afro-German minorities, and organized the 1991 follow-up National Congress held in Berlin that addressed the plight of immigrant, Jewish, and Black German women. They also published documentation Ways to Alliances with revised conference papers, again, producing knowledge from that conference. In these settings, she discussed racism and the necessity to encourage and recognize diversity in Germany. Dialogue and solidarity are what Ayim gained through countless international invitations, in which she garnered acclaim as a captivating performer. Guadeloupean writer Matse Condé confirmed this by noting Ayim's exceptional voice, unique and already in the hearts of all of us who are persecuted and thirsty. Ayim used her appeal and cultural productions to bolster her position and to retain recognition for her causes and community. She integrated diasporic themes and tropes in her poetry, privileging diverse Black diasporic knowledge forms. Her literature and later her doctoral work in education also gave her an opportunity to share specific knowledge about the history and plight of Afro-Germans and to use it to not only forge solidarity with others, but to incite social change. She also taught at a variety of schools in Berlin. So she was at the Alice Soleiman School for Social Work. She taught at the Free University. So she's also disseminating that knowledge in classrooms. Her international travel included her involvement with anti-racist causes across and beyond the European continent, which also had didactic purposes. Ayim recognized how racism, intolerance, and marginalization impacted Black people and people of color in Europe, and was predicated on a powerful, often unspoken discourse of whiteness. She continually addressed those themes at multiple national, continental, and international venues. Her presence at the 1990 Conference on Exclusion and Intolerance, Modern Racism in the Netherlands and the Federal Republic of Germany, held in the Netherlands, as well as the University of Warwick and the Technical University of Berlin's 1993 Joint Conference, Discrimination, Racism, and Citizenship, both enabled her to connect with academics, writers, and activists alike. She unsettled notions that Europe had overcome its problems with racism and spoke about the liminal citizenship that Blacks and other Europeans of color embodied, as well as the precarious status of immigrants in Europe. These events also fueled her optimism. She was a participant in the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books that was founded in 1982. So you can't say that 5 times, International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books. I can only say it twice. It took place in London, and it featured many prominent Black diasporic figures and included a variety of cultural and political events. These events also demonstrate the constitutive nature of knowledge and power, again, sort of getting back at this idea of sort of intellectual activism, particularly as they offered opportunities for critical intellectual exchange and circulated different forms of knowledge through panel discussions, public readings, film screenings, etc. The event was founded by John LaRose. He was a Black British activist, and these events were considered very empowering and enlightening and illustrated Black European solidarity and mobilization at the grassroots level. And it's important to note that LaRose sadly died in 2006, but he and Mai had a great relationship. And so because of COVID, I haven't been able to go back to check out some of their correspondence. He founded a George Padmore Institute in London that has all of these amazing sources. So whenever COVID disappears, kind of unknown when, but I'll try to go. Ayim continued her intellectual activism and internationalism by participating in South American and African events that proved to be critical in her dissemination of knowledge and the contours of racial difference and oppression in Europe. Her literature drew attention to racial and racist dynamics in Germany. One of her poems, Borderless and Brazen, Grenzenlos und Unverschämt, which tackled racialized issues in reunified Germany, was included in a 1993 special issue of Afro-Brazilian magazine entitled Yes to Life, sponsored by the group Black Women Make Poetry. The magazine also featured works from the Caribbean American poet June Jordan and Afro-Dominican scholar Uchi Curel. At a cultural festival in Brazil, Ayim connected with other Black diasporic authors, and multi-directional influences emerged that provided her with sustenance and empowerment. Here, power and strength fostered the cultivation of solidarities and the sharing of ideas and tactics. At the annual 1994 Panifest Symposium in Ankara, she enlightened audiences on Afro-German experiences. She gave a paper, People of African Descent in Europe, the Afro-German Experience. She connected with multiple scholars across the diaspora at this conference, and also became more acquainted with West African Andikara symbols, which she later incorporated into her first poetry volume, published with Orlando in 1995, called Blues in Schwarz-Weiß, or Blues in Black-White. With this conscious deployment of diasporic symbolism in her artwork, deployment of diasporic symbols in her work, she also privileged the visual as a viable form of knowledge. She participated in cultural festivals throughout South Africa that same year. She remained attentive to intercultural connections and diasporic politics, signaling that her internationalism was personal and political. In conclusion, these narratives reveal the intellectual practices of Black German women who documented and curated their movement. By doing so, they demonstrated how these radical acts reflect their ability to gain power and agency by determining their significance of the movement in non-normative and anti-racist ways. Reiser, Ayim, and other Black Germans decolonized the public sphere and acknowledged rather than bracketed their differences, showing how they were constitutive parts of the nation and their organizing. They also read along the biased grain, which is what Marissa Fuentes argues in her book, to point out the persistent racial and colonial thinking that Germans practice and normalize, resulting in Black Germans' marginalization and erasure from the nation. In this way, knowledge did not function through state or federal institutions, but through the intellectual activism of Black Germans in both private and public ways. Moreover, my discussion of everyday intellectual activism of Black Germans also demonstrates the necessity of broadening intellectualism to include knowledge production at the level of labor, activism, and interpersonal connections, as Carol Boyce Davies remarked in her 2008 intellectual biography of Black socialist feminist Claudia Jones. Thus, workshops, conferences, flyers, all of these materials offer us a textured archival corpus of Black German intellectual activism. Their knowledge production and dissemination were epistemic acts that sought to push the boundaries of knowing, feeling, and understanding, as well as interpreting, not only for their Black compatriots, but also for white German compatriots. Acquiring and circulating alternative knowledge was a powerful intervention. Reiser and Ayim left legacies as dynamic quotidian intellectuals. They built connections with Black Germans, Black people in the diaspora, people of color in Germany, and others abroad. They, in the process, reimagined the role of intellectuals, marking Black Germans as poets and thinkers, or Dichter and Denker, in their own right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this illuminating and thought-provoking talk. We do have time for questions, so I would like to open the floor to your comments or queries.
Thanks so much for the
Hi again.
presentation.
Yeah.
I was just curious, based on the time that you spent speaking with these activists and your examination of the documents, how much of their goal was community building and how much of it was sort of trying to influence the white German population, and what sort of negotiations took place among these activists and sort of what their goals should be?
That's a really good question. So the first and foremost, the movement was about community building. So fostering connections with other Black Germans who are oftentimes isolated. So in the larger context of post-war Germany, a lot of these Black Germans were raised in foster homes, either in adopted families, or they were raised by their white family members. So they're not really circulating with other people of the Black diaspora. So this is why it's like, once they see each other, they're like, we've got to hang out. We've got to be with one another. So it's mostly for the fostering this sense of community building, and then through there unsettling the norms and saying, look, Black Germans are not a contradiction. Like, we have to challenge your understanding of what Germanness is. We have to challenge your understanding that German colonies were just colonies that affected the colonies and didn't have an imprint in the metropole. So it's through that they start to sort of make even more concrete interventions. Yeah, that's another good question. Sorry, did I interrupt you? Did you have another? Okay. I'm so excited. I was like, yeah. Sorry. So I was like, oh my goodness, so rude. Sorry. Yeah, so this was another thing that I was hoping to do in 2020 before the pandemic. So I learned during the revising process for the manuscript that there was an East Berlin ISD group that was connected to the West Berlin ISD group. So they were doing work with each other prior to the fall of the wall. So this was common knowledge, and they were just really working with organizing a variety of events. So I was hoping to find out more about that East Berlin ISD group and sort of talk to people and sort of see if they had sources that I could look at. But then the pandemic hit, and so I was like, that's not going to happen now. But there is more, there's more stuff about Dresden groups, Leipzig groups, no groups in Rostock, so the northeastern part of Germany. But these are groups that are merging and acquiring funding from other European entities. So they really start to become more dynamic after the fall of the wall. But I think for me, it was really important to learn more about that East Berlin group, because that shows us that there's still connections across the wall in ways that we didn't recognize, and still grassroots connections across the wall. But I won't know about that until I go back. But email me, and I should probably have, hopefully this summer, I can be like, yes, they did this.
Yeah, really fascinating talk, and I think this period, the 1980s and 90s, is such a fascinating period that now really only comes into focus of historical writing, and we're just beginning to understand all the complexities of that particular moment. And you know, one of them, of course, is that precisely the period that you described is also the period of the emergence of a sort of popular Holocaust memory
Yeah.
in Germany, right? Begins in the
80s.
80s and really takes off in the post-unification period.
Yeah.
And you know, we're of course still debating this, but you know, I'm sort of curious what you think, whether sort of your protagonists felt that you know Holocaust memory was also kind of a screen memory that made it actually more difficult to address you know racism, colloquial racism, because it kind of dominates this idea of what we mean by race, right? It can only be understood in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of you know National Socialist ideas about race, and not so much this kind of racism in daily life. So that's my first question, and then I had another question about the German part of Afro-German or Black German.
Yeah.
So you know, when you cited this poetry, it seems like that the reference was, one example you gave was to the Deep South in the U.S. There was an article about Josephine Baker. So the question is there an attempt to, you know, on the part of these protagonists to write themselves into the history of the nation by sort of drawing on German examples, and also perhaps because what's really impressive about them, of course, is the kind of international connections that they forge, you know, with other European countries, and I wonder whether these sort of transnational connections then also create a sense of what's specific about, you know, being a Black German as opposed to, you know, a Black person in France or in England.
These are good questions, Frank. I'll try to answer them. So I think you're right. I think the 80s are particularly striking for a variety of reasons. So it's in 1982 that the Roma officially recognized as victims of the Holocaust. And that's because of grassroots Roma activism. And so you have Roma activism, Asian German activism, and Black German activism all coming to the fore. Mai is writing about the complexities of that, you know, that legacy of racialization in the German context in her poetry, also in her speeches. She's talking about that. She, much like Audre Lorde, is writing about Holocaust memory. How do we remember these figures? How do we remember this moment? And I think what's so interesting is that they see the parallels, especially after the fall of the wall, that we're seeing this ethno-nationalism emerge again in significantly frightening ways, in which we see this is what people are shooting for in terms of this white nation in ways that are problematic. So there's more, I mean, I talk a little about it in the book very briefly, but there's more work in terms of drawing those parallels between the Holocaust, Jewish identity, Jewish experiences, and Black Germans and other minority experiences. I wrote a small blog over the summer about sort of, so there was all of this like uproar about colonial memory and Holocaust memory in the German context, especially last summer. And I was asked to write a blog by Jennifer Evans about like Black German post-colonial ideas about the Holocaust. So I talked about Audre Lorde and her poetry in Berlin, which is explicitly engages with racialization, and also the parallels about Jewish experiences and Black German experiences. And so I think part of the larger, so I'm working on a biography on Mai, and part of my larger emphasis is looking at some of that unpublished poetry that deals with that more explicitly. And then there are other Black Germans who are Black, Jewish, and, you know, so they're navigating a variety of identities and trying to situate that in the larger movement. And that's also, there's also a tension with them trying to do that. So that's the first question. I hope that answered the first question. And then the second question, what's specifically German that's sort of featured in these magazines? And it's not only these magazines, it's also the socialization of Black Germans. Like they're German. One sort of particularly interesting example is I went to one of the Bundestreffens when I was a dissertator. And so I'm, you know, on the train going to the Bundestreffen. I'd heard about it for years. I was like excited American graduate student, like, yay. And then I show up at the Bundestreffen and it felt very German. Like, it's hard to describe. I was like, I mean, wait, and it was like, they're German, they're socialized German. There's like a way of going in which I was like,
I was anticipating it to be like, a family reunion fear of, in the African American context where you're like, hey, there's no potato salad, but I was like, yeah. And then when I get there, it's like, oh, it's not like that. I mean, it's not like they are not accepting, but it's a slow cultivating of connections. And that's pretty clear. And so it took some time for myself to warm up to others. So it's very, they're very German. And then in terms of the works in the magazines, you can see that they're also drawing from German traditions. So I only focused on some of the diasporic conditions, but there's also a German tradition of like poetry and intellectualism that they're tapping into. Look, this is beyond thinking about Berlin as a site. Germany is considered the site of like Dichter and Denker, poets and thinkers, or poets and philosophers. And so they're tapping into that too, to say we too are like our kinsmen, so to speak, but we're also like our diasporic kinsmen. And they really just make a distinction between their experiences and, say, Black British or Black French experiences in the sense of that sort of colonial legacy too. So they're like, look, we're not like the British that has a sort of longer lineage of, the tentacles of colonialism were everywhere. A third of the globe was at one point under the hands of the British. This is not a similar colonial context. There may be some interesting similarities in terms of racialization, but also distinct differences. The British and the French cases, there's Fanon, there's Gandhi. The German colonial case, there's no one like that. There's not a comparable, post-colonial in that respect. And so there's also different colonizing missions that they try to sort of talk about in terms of those distinctions. That I think is important because, yeah, European colonizers are bad and it was a long experience, but there's also distinct differences of how they function. And quite, we oftentimes forget Askari soldiers from Tanzania were committed to fighting in World War I. There was a loyalty to Germany. And so that's something that they try to tease out in some of their work, especially when they're sort of talking about the repatriation of Namibian bones to Germany, where they're like, look, genocide occurred earlier, not only in Europe. How do we sort of reconcile those dynamics? Hopefully that answers your second question.
Yeah, just follow up on that. I mean, the 1980s, 1990s are also a period in which sort of other minorities in Germany find their voice. And I think most of the sort of public sphere is probably focused on guest workers and their descendants. And I was just wondering how they related to those movements, and also in a very practical sense. I mean, many German cities at the time introduced sort of Ausländerräte, like councils in which sort of non-citizens had a voice, mostly on local affairs. And I think that is very important for guest workers and their children, often born in Germany, but with this kind of mixed identity thing. So I would just like to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe also, I mean, we asked about how they defined German in Black German, but how do they define Black? I assume Turkish people are not Black. So how do they relate to that?
Okay, these are also good questions. It's like a day of great questions from people. So in the German context, so I recently, related to the book, but also separate from the book, presented on a panel about human rights in the German context. And I focused on the Immigrant Political Forum, which I talk about in the book a little bit, but how they were pushing for more anti-racist legislation to sort of help with immigrants. And so you see their ability to co-sponsor workshops about immigrant rights, especially sort of the gendered implications. So for immigrant women who can't get pregnant, or if they're pregnant, they're deported. And so there's some interesting gender dynamics that they try to emphasize in some of the workshops and conferences that they have. And I think that shows that there shows that willingness to have these cross-cultural connections in ways that seem to be useful in really codifying something that results in not necessarily quantifiable data about racism, but some legislative measures, some lobbying.
in an ad defra letter to its members. They're like, in 1996, 1995, they're like, we need an Afro census to know about, we need a census about race so that we know how discrimination is occurring in schools, employment, and housing. And now, 2021, 2020, the report, the Afro census, the sort of Afro census that takes place, the report was released in November of 2021 talking about discrimination in all levels of Germany. It exists. So now they have some of that quantifiable data, but this is something they were wanting to do in the 90s, also in the 80s. So now they have it. They include in their definition of Black, much like they do in the British context, Black as a political and cultural signifier. So it's not only tied to phenotype alone. So you have individuals of Turkish descent, individuals of Indian descent who were also in the movement. It's not in such large numbers as, say, the Black British case, but there are some there. And so they see Blackness as a signifier for oppression more broadly. So you don't necessarily have to be phenotypically Black to be a part of the movement. And in many of the brochures, so many of the regional brochures, they're talking about Asian and Black communities more broadly. So there really it is outreach to those other communities. And so that's part of your first question. And then the second question, I sort of answered too, but yeah, they really stick with that idea of the flexibility of Blackness, not tied to phenotype alone. And they're pushing for those events to be cognizant of the flexibility of Blackness. And it's also like you're marginalized, you're racialized, you're adopting this political marker to sort of signify who you're aligning with. Hope that answers it.
We had a question by Angela.
Thank you, Tiffany, for your work in this presentation. I learned a lot and I appreciate it so much.
Thanks.
As a person also interested in ways of knowing in the everyday, I was really interested in your reference early on in the talk to the work of Fuentes in the 17th century Barbados, and you used the phrase, or quoted the phrase, we receive them in this way, talking about sort of like the instantiation as subjects through the way you represent paperwork in terms of enslaved peoples. And I was interested in the way that process of reception might be continual, so that the epistemic interventions you're talking about also function sort of in a non-linear, maybe discursive way.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was interested in hearing a little bit more about how that sort of looks or was experienced in the German context as the quotidian intellectuals are responding to that sort of notion of being received as a subject in a particular way, almost outside of any everyday experience.
Yeah.
Does my question make sense?
Yeah. Thank you for it. It's a good question too. I think it was a combination of things that draw me to the everyday that I don't think Black Germans would necessarily say that was their only focal point. But it's because of the sort of sources and where I see like the everyday reappearing, but they're also able to talk about some of those institutional aspects of racism. So it's like everyday racism, institutional racism, and like screaming that institutional racism exists in the German context. And so for them, they recognize immediately that like Germans don't see them as Germans. And they talk about that repeatedly. So there's a lot of poetry, a lot of essays, a lot of work to sort of talk about how they're automatically presumed to be foreigners or outsiders in the context of Germany. And then they sort of reclaim this identity, they reclaim their space in the nation. I know the nation state is problematic in terms of a variety of reasons, but in terms of really placing themselves, they see themselves as rightful German citizens. Some of them are, they have the Ausweis, they have the Pass, they have proof that they're German. Some of them are sort of been naturalized as German. And they're sort of showing that as a way of saying, look, I am situating myself in the everyday to also sort of show you how imbricated all of these systems are in the everyday. Does that make sense a little? And so I think the everyday is important, but it's like one mode for them to really articulate who they are and who they're sort of working against in ways. And then they see themselves represented in a variety of ways. So they see themselves not only represented as
being excluded, but in many ways they see themselves as not represented. I think that's part of the issue, is that like they've been rendered invisible, excuse me, not indivisible. So they've been rendered invisible, and so their reception is, in many ways, there's no reception for them. And then in some ways they're, you know, ignored, but also fetishized. So they're working through a lot of like spaces of how they're received, and they're challenging those different perceptions about them. Does that answer? Yeah. Okay. You're welcome.
Before we wrap up here, I wanted to prompt you just briefly to speak to one aspect
Yeah.
of the women you presented to us, because I know it's prominent in your book and we haven't had a chance to
read it.
discuss
Yeah.
That's the question of sexuality and queerness,
Yeah.
which matters so much to the formation of this movement.
Yeah.
So if you maybe in conclusion want to say a few things about that form of marginalization and many women
Absolutely.
experience, both within and outside of the movement.
Yeah, so a lot of queer women helped form the movement. And I didn't talk about that a lot. Part of the larger project for Mai is also tapping into some of her queerness. So some of her poetry deals with that queer aspect, yeah. And there's also speculation about, so sadly Mai committed suicide in 1996. But there's also speculation about the loves of Mai's life that I need to do more research to come out and sort of figure out. But there's some queerness embedded in her work. And then the movement was created by, co-created, by queer women, queer Black women who were involved in the lesbian movement in Germany, were, you know, working in the women's movement in Germany, and found no real, they couldn't be themselves fully. And so I think this is where the movement offers them a space to authentically be queer, Black, and troubling for many. And then I argue in the book, and more largely, that, you know, Black Germans are already queer. They're non-normative. And that already sort of queers them. I know that people are like, we're queer in everything. But I think in this case, there's a layered aspect of queerness going on here, because they are outside the boundaries of the norm. So in essence, they're certainly queer. And then you also have queer women involved in the movement, helping to push it, having connections with Lord and many other queer activists across the globe. So queer identity, sexual identity is a key part of the movement as well. I just didn't tap into everything.
But
Yeah.
you gave us so much, and the book is there to be read. It's fantastic.
Thanks.
Highly recommended.
Thank you for
you so
coming.
much.
Thank you for the invitation.